Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Land, where we explore news in and about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm senior religion reporter Peggy Fletcher-Stack. I'm joined by managing editor David Noyce, who oversees our faith coverage. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Peggy.
We invite you, our listeners, to show your support for Mormon Land by going to patreon.com, where with a donation as little as $3 a month, you can access all of the Tribune's religion coverage, transcripts to our podcasts, and the Mormon Land newsletter. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/Mormonland. Now for today's episode. Young Latter-day Saint couples are delaying marriage and having fewer children than in the past, according to recent statistics cited by Dallin H, a top leader in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. While acknowledging that today's financial conditions can be difficult for this generation, Oaks, first counselor in the faith's governing First Presidency, nonetheless urged a global gathering of 18 to 30-year-old members to fight the trends. Quote, marriage is central to the purpose of mortal life and what follows, he said. We are children of a loving Heavenly Father who created us with the capacity to follow his commandment to multiply and replenish the earth. Here via Zoom to discuss Oaks' statistics and advice is Jennifer Finlayson-Fife, a Latter-day Saint marriage and sex therapist in Chicago. Jennifer, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, in his speech, Dallin Oaks reported that the age of Latter-day Saints at the time of their first marriage rose from 21 for females and 23 for males in 1970 to 28 and nearly 27 respectively in 2015. Have you seen, does this correspond with the trends you've seen among Latter-day Saint couples?
Well, I don't know how, in touch I am with the youngest couples, because usually those aren't the people that are coming to me for help. But I have to say that number does surprise me a little bit, because it just seems so much older than even when I, was getting married. So I don't have good data to say one way or the the but yeah,
just observationally
it does definitely. Yes, it does seem among just like nieces and nephews and their friends that it's much later. It's taking longer to find that person, longer to move in that direction.
It just seemed a little higher to me too, actually.
Yeah.
I would have said 24, 25, not 28. President Oaks also said that Latter-day Saint couples are having fewer children than earlier generations. Does that seem accurate to you?
That does seem accurate. So
why do you
smaller families?
Why do you think that's happening?
I really don't know. I mean, I think the culture in general has shifted. So the larger culture has shifted towards fewer children and later marriage. And maybe Latter-day Saints are just kind of lagging, but in the same trend. I think there's probably economic reasons that I don't, really have a grasp on in order to speak to them. But I'm sure there's economic reasons. There's social shifts in terms of how we think about what it is to be a couple, what it is to be a woman, a man. I think they're the traditional roles that our parents grew up with or we grew up with really kind of pointed more towards marriage and children than I think the culture that our children grew up in. And so, or at least I should speak for myself, but at least my children grew up in who are just now, coming of age. So I think it's a different ethos, and it's shaping Latter-day Saints, young Latter-day Saints, as much as anyone.
So, Jennifer, we're going to talk about older and younger, and I know those are real relative terms.
Sure, right.
Are marriages more likely to last if the couples are older when they marry?
Well, I've seen conflicting research on this. And so some research that I was looking at, a decade ago was really pointing to, the more established the woman was financially, the less likely to divorce. So if she had options outside of the marriage, that seemed to make her either slower to marry because she didn't have to, or with the clear sense that she could leave if she wanted to, either of those would seem to be a positive effect for a marriage. And that may surprise people, because I think a lot of the the idea was marry them when they're young enough that they have to stay. I remember hearing things like that when I was at BYU, right? But I think when someone feels that they are trapped in a marriage, it actually undermines the happiness and the stability of the marriage. So I've seen that research, but then there's also research that was coming out of BYU that did not show that people that married earlier were necessarily more likely to divorce. So I don't really know, what is in fact true, but I can imagine ways in which marrying early could be very detrimental. And I can imagine ways that marrying early could be positive, and the same for marrying later. Mm-hmm. So I don't have a strong sense of this is how it should be. The one thing I would say, though, is that probably what generally is not a good idea is feeling that you should rush into marriage because you're fearful of not having any other options or fearful of having sex. If it's driven by anxiety and fear rather than a sense of desire, I think that generally tends to undermine the foundation of the marriage.
So I want to drill down a little bit on this because he warned against, quote, delaying marriage. What are the downsides, if any, to delaying marriage?
Well, I would imagine it's really why are you delaying it and what's driving that decision. There's some people that really get into a perfectionistic mindset, which is, I think it's wise to be prudent and to be thoughtful about you're making a big decision and to be thoughtful about what are the implications of that choice. At the same time, I've worked with people that are imagining there is a right enough person that they will avoid the struggle that I would say is somewhat inherent to marriage. I don't know if struggle is quite the right word, but the ways that a marriage pressures your development as a person. And so people imagine if I can get the right fit, the person that's the most like me, always going to be attractive to me, then I will be happy. And there's a kind of intimacy avoidance or a kind of commitment avoidance that I think ultimately undermines happiness if one stays stuck in that. That it gets harder and harder the older you get.
Do the church's teachings about eternal marriage play into this? In other words, I how to say it, but raise the stakes about the decisions of when and whether to marry?
Well, I remember as a missionary that was not a selling point for a lot of my investigators. That was like, wait a minute, there's no out, there's no no reprieve. So that's an interesting question. Does it raise the stakes? Maybe. I think more that it can create a sense of what I'm more familiar with in the couples I've worked with is there's the feeling of not having the option of leaving the marriage because you've promised like forever now. And so I remind people that that's just simply not true, that you always have choices. Now, you may not like the consequences of your choices. You may not like the judgment that you receive. You may not like some of the downside. But when people act within the feeling that marriage is a prison, again, it really undermines the marriage being a place of happiness, friendship, passion. And so I think that teaching can underscore that feeling of entrapment when someone is not sure it's what they want.
So what could be some of the downsides of marrying early? We talked about downsides of marrying later. What would be some of the downsides of marrying early?
Well, one strong one is if you, a couple, and I think of women more on this front perhaps, but maybe unfairly, I think a lot of women are kind of socialized into dependency, a kind of righteous dependency. I think that's shifting in the church, but certainly many people I work with felt like it was an act of faith to get married early and to step into that role of wife and supporter and mother. But they did it as a way to try to find an identity more than having an identity and choosing that path. And so when you sort of leap from your parents' arms into the arms of your husband and you never touch the ground, right, that can create, again, that sense of entrapment, that sense of dependency. It can make one feel unclear that they could make it on their own. They have no sense of who they are outside of relationships to others and taking care of others. And while there's enormous strength and benefit in being someone who's able to care for others and support others, when it's the only identity that you know, it can be pretty fragile and can lead to depression and resentment and anger in a marriage and, kind of looking to the husband to solve your unhappiness, which he can't do. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's talk about sex. Given the church's stance against premarital sex, do you think that in the past is what propelled couples into marriage earlier? And
yes.
Is that, the church hasn't changed its stance, but yet couples are later.
Well, in general, just the national trend is that kids, non-LDS kids are having sex much later than they used to. So people are more, on screens. They aren't going out as much with people. So I think that's part of that trend possibly, is that kids are not being kind of forced into social experience like they were back when I was a kid. I feel so much like an old person right now. But, you went to the church activity, whether or not you felt like you were close friends with anybody, because it's just what you did. It was that, like, now kids have it as a more optional thing. And I think in talking to some of the younger people in the church, there's a deep sense of loneliness. So I think that's a part, just coming back to that earlier question of what's part of the trend, is there's just less social connection. And so maybe that's what allows people to hang around and not get married. Maybe that's why the sexual issue is not as pressing as it maybe was. But yes, I do think that a lot of times in speaking about like fear driving the decision, the fear of having sex outside of marriage often was a driver has been in the clients I've worked with, a driver of getting married. I also think it can falsely be for people that once we're having sex, like these places of disconnection, these ways that we don't really feel like we understand each other, will be resolved through a sexual relationship. So a kind of false promise of what sex can bring to a marriage. And so I've worked with couples that have kind of done both of those things, rushed in to not have sex, imagined sex would solve things, then imagined children would solve things. And none of those worked out. Mm-hmm.
So how do you think the church could help these couples get ready for satisfying sexual relationships without changing its teachings on sex exclusively for marriage between a man and a woman? What can the church do to help?
Yeah. Well, I don't think we need to change our ideal, just because I think that the ideal of a full commitment to a full sexual relationship is a wonderful one. But that said, I think that we conflate evil and sensuality and sexuality unfairly. So, that if you're having any sensual or sexual feelings, that is a problem. Rather than as a full adult dating, you're going to have sexual feelings. There's no other way to do this, right? And not if you're planning to have an intimate marriage. And so rather than the anxiety, the presence of those feelings or any intimate contact is inherently wrong, to think about it more in terms of valuing this part of oneself, cherishing this ability to love and be loved through the body, cherishing embodiment, right, as a part of our spirituality. And so less fear-driven and more goal-driven. So there's nothing wrong with these feelings. I value that I feel attraction. I value that I desire to touch and be touched. And I also value the idea of commitment for the fullest expression of physical desire and intimacy. So to hold what it is we're aiming towards without shaming that process of beginning to integrate one's sexuality and desire. And so being less afraid of it, this whole sexuality being close to murder, is just a terrifying element that undermines our ability to integrate sexuality, feel good about it, and then direct it in ways that lead us towards what our ideals are, what we're aiming for. So less fear, more ideal, and more acceptance of that process of coming to terms with yourself as a sexual being and making choices that accrue to your ability to be committed and love another person through your body. Mm-hmm.
So I want to shift gears to another part of President Oaks' speech. And he cited a poll. It was a little bit general in what it was stating, but a poll that showed the, quote, importance to adults of having children has fallen in the past 25 years from 66% to 33%. I'm not exactly sure what the importance of having children and how you're supposed to interpret that if you're taking that question, but what positives and negatives do children bring to marriages?
Mm-hmm. Well, they kill a lot of sexual desire.
It's called exhaustion,
desire
right?
To have them usually, and then they kill the desire. So that is to say that the negative is, if you ask couples how happy they are in the thick of child rearing, their happiness score is lower than people that have no children. If you just were to poll in any moment, right, they're lower. However, that sense of meaning, right, and that sense of what you're creating and building is very powerful. And so the kind of momentary happiness measures can be low, but the overall happiness measures can be high, right? So that is, and I'm not using the words really well, but this sort of sense of like what I'm creating, the meaning we're creating together is positive. And so I think that one of the positives is this shared goal, collaborating towards rearing a family that you care about, that you value, that feel that you've brought your best to. I also just think, when one of the things I teach a lot in the work that I do is that demands actually develop us. And I don't mean to say we shouldn't be prudent about which demands we step into, which commitments we take on, but it's really discipline and pressure that develops capacity within us. And so while rearing children is seldom easy, it does forge our character. It does, or it can, if we will let it, right? It does push us into people more capable of love, more capable of compassion for others, compassion for ourselves, right? We evolve into wiser people through those commitments. And so, yes, it is easier in a sense to have no demand on you. In a way it is, never to marry, never to have children. But I'm not sure that it pressures the character development in the same way that really aligning yourself and saying, I'm going to care about this other person, even when they drive me crazy. I'm going to invest in my children, even when it's inconvenient. I think that it pushes us to evolve and to become better people.
President Oaks acknowledged that finances, especially home ownership, he singled out as tough right now, especially on young couples and those maybe beginning to have children. How should couples view finances? He basically said, go forward with faith, kind of, but finances, I'm sure, put strains on marriage and when you're having children. How should couples weigh those? Well, so I do think finances can be very stressful for people and can really stress a family and a couple. And I think people honestly need to be wary of saying, okay, I'm going to do this because I believe God will bless me for doing it. I think that's a little bit dangerous, which is different than this idea that I'm going to be rewarded for doing something that others might think of as reckless, okay? And I might even think of as reckless, I myself, but I'm going to do it because I think I'll be blessed. I don't think that's a safe way to do it. On the other hand, if one says, like, I value having children, I believe it's the best thing for me to do, and we can tolerate that we're not going to have as much money right now, but it matters to us. We still believe it's the right thing to do. Well, that's very different because it's deliberate, it's chosen, it's, and people don't need as much as we think to be happy, right? That is, we just visited where my mom grew up in Idaho, and they were dirt poor. I mean, they were, sharecroppers in Shelley, Idaho. And, my mom was saying, like, there really isn't a sizable difference in happiness between now having much more and that period. It was harder, but expectations were lower. And I think one of the challenges is that we have a society that has high expectations around what you should be able to afford and have.
And it's more that it's not so much that we need those things to be happy, but we maybe anticipate or hope for it, and that undermines our ability to do it. So it's my long way of saying, don't do it for reward. But if you do choose it, like, do it deliberately, knowing what you're giving up and knowing what it is that you think is the benefit to you, to sacrifice some of the financial ease that may come with having children.
Mm-hmm. And in a global church, that is going to be different.
That's right.
Depending on where you live. Like, our society is going to view success and what you need to have differently than other parts of the world, right?
Yes, that's right. Absolutely. Yes.
So obviously you probably have a special view of this, but have you seen a rise in divorce among Latter-day Saint couples?
I'm not a good measure because I don't know what the overall statistics are, right? So the people coming to me are trying to sort out their marriage, and a percentage of them do ultimately divorce, but I don't really know if it's increased or decreased, or I'm hoping that I'm helping it decrease, but I'm not sure. so yeah.
Well, do you think the church's teachings about divorce? I mean, I've met in my life many more divorced Latter-day Saint couples than I did when I was a kid. But is that a good thing? Are people not staying so long in bad marriages? Or is it
It's so tricky to answer because yes, I think you're right. And again, I think it's sort of on the same cultural trend, that divorce is just seen as a more acceptable option, and people can be seen as good people and divorced, right? Which maybe was different in the 60s or something. Yeah. But whether or not it's a good thing, I certainly think that people knowing that they really have choices is always a good thing. Like, feeling like you can't get divorced because you can't own land, for example, as a woman or something, it's just like a terrible reason to stay married, right? So the more that people feel like they're owning the choices that they're making, the better. There are some marriages in which I was completely clear that that divorcing was safer and better for all involved because of abusiveness, because of someone unwilling to kind of deal with their problematic behavior. But sometimes people divorce because they fall in love with someone else, or they just imagine their life's going to be so much easier, and they can just have this way of getting out of the ways that the marriage is pressuring them, and it's delusional. And so I've also seen people who are getting divorced out of fantasy than out of reality. And so, again, I would say yes to choices always. And yet, the more wisdom we have in both partnering and unpartnering, the better. Mm-hmm.
So how could the church, a church that puts such high value on marriage and children and families, help couples make, for the lack of a better word, better marital choices?
Well, one of the things that, again, what I would say, I think a lot of these ideas that I teach, I did learn in church, but we often have a spectrum of advice. And so I think the advice of just do things and the blessings will come is just something to be careful about. When we're living by truthful principles, yes, blessings do come. That is to say, we live in the benefit of those wise choices. But imagine we're doing something that doesn't really make sense to us. It's driven by fear, driven by this imagining that if I'm obedient, I will get some blessing in some form, it's a younger model of thinking, and one that I think often people are distressed because they did things to obey, but then things didn't work out. And so it drives their resentment, drives disillusionment with the church. I just don't think it's a good basis for making some of these decisions. On the other hand, I think we can say, like, marriage is a divine institution. It drives our development. Now, that's different than you can't develop in any other way. Like, any time that you are in meaningful relationships and you're trying to look at yourself and your impact on others, you're going to grow. The way that marriage helps us is not because we find the right one, the one we were supposed to get, that we were with in the preexistence and all that. And once you find the right one, it's all going to work out. None of that stuff. But instead, the right one is the one that you desire to struggle with. And by struggle, I don't mean you're just miserable all the time, but you see yourself, if you're humble and open, you see the imperfection that you bring you see it in the eyes of your partner. You see it in their response to you. Human beings are remarkably unself-aware. We're very good at tracking other people. We know what their liabilities are. We know where they're blind to themselves. We're totally blind to ourselves, most of us. And yet we think we see 20/20. And a partner is often telling you the truth about you, not perfectly, often filtered through their own immaturities, but they're telling you realities about you that it behooves you to see and acknowledge and to learn from and to bring better. And so if you bring that basic humility to marriage and you're willing to see who you are and you're partnered with someone who will do it also, you have the growth mechanism that a marriage needs to grow into something happy and intimate, grow into something where it's a true home, a place you can be yourself, a place where you can feel known and really cared for, as well as care for and know the other. But if you don't have that growth mechanism, that humility, the willingness to face yourself, the willingness to repent, you will suffer in that marriage because, and you need two people who will do it. So the thing we can teach is to not wait for marriage to find the perfect one, but to know you're stepping into a process and to embrace the process, embrace the struggle in it, because it's there designed to help you grow into a wiser, more loving being.
Yeah, some of those lessons might be good at church.
Yes, exactly.
In a more complicated way than often is given. So last question, of course, the church has acknowledged that more than half of its adult members in the U.S. and worldwide are single. How do you think this advice about marriage and children applies to them?
Yeah, it's tricky because, it can make singles often feel more isolated. You know, when we're so marriage focused, there's a lot of strength in that. But of course, if you're not married, then it can make you feel like you're not a full adult. You don't have the full status of the married couple. Sometimes when young single adults or even older single adults have like the married couple as the chaperone, it can feel really condescending, like we're not considered full adults. So I think it's tricky. I do think it's fair to say the more important a relationship is to you, the more that relationship will bless you and pressure you, right? It's easy to be kind and generally it's easy to be kind with people that you just are with at work, right? Or they don't affect your life that much. Their liabilities don't shape you as much as somebody that you're sharing a bed with. And so I think we can talk about it in terms of a spectrum. The more you involve yourself, you're a good aunt, a good uncle. You really are invested in the people that you work with, in your friendships, and you care about them. Those will also pressure your growth by how you care for others, by how you learn about yourself through your impact on others. So relationships, I think of Christianity and our faith as a highly relational theology, because it's in relationship that we learn truth, that we know truth through how we love and care for each other. Marriage is the sort of, and children are probably the highest pressure relationships, but all relationships develop us and help us.
Jennifer Finlayson-Fife, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
And thanks to Dave Noyce.
Always a pleasure.
And to our producer, Nicole Winfield. We remind our listeners that they can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.